Hey everybody, this is Dr. Hathcock, and this video covers the second part of our Reconstruction topic, and we pick it up here with Congressional Reconstruction. With presidential Reconstruction, with Johnson's plans and ideas, I talked about how Congress didn't really care for what was going on in the South. And so what happens in March of 1867 is Congress essentially takes over the whole process. They are going to pass a series of laws that collectively we call the Reconstruction Acts. By the way, these laws were all vetoed by Andrew Johnson, and Congress overrode his veto anyways. So they'll pass and they'll come to be. And in looking at these Reconstruction Acts, it's a series of laws where basically the Congress is going to wrestle control of Reconstruction away from the President of the United States. Okay, the first of the Reconstruction Acts to look at, or I guess the first thing to talk about, is how the South will be divided into 5 military districts. You can see up here on your PowerPoint what the 5 military districts look like. See way out there to the west, Texas and Louisiana together make up military district number 5. And in dividing the South into 5 military districts, they're basically going to that point I made earlier where they're trying to say that the South is conquered territory. They're not really states anymore. When they seceded, they stopped being states. You'll recall that President Lincoln said that he should be in charge of Reconstruction because he's in charge of the Army. But Congress is saying that they should have some say in Reconstruction because these are conquered territories. So that's what this looks like, is dividing the South into 5 military districts. Okay, point number 2, each military district will be given a Union general in control of it. You can see out there, district number 5 is going to have General Phil Sheridan in charge of Texas and Louisiana here under Congressional Reconstruction. Phil Sheridan, I don't think he cared for his time here in Texas. He said that if he owned hell and he owned Texas, he'd go live in hell and rent Texas out to some damn fool. But anyways, Phil Sheridan will be in charge of military district number 5, and you can see there, the various guys who are being in control of these districts. All right, so far, point number 1, the South was divided into 5 military districts. Point number 2, each district is headed up by a Union general. Point number 3, these Union generals would answer to someone called Secretary of War, and that's normal chain of command. The Secretary of War is the person they would answer to. Side note to that, in today's world, we call it the Defense Department. After World War II, I guess it was a little too aggressive to have it called the Secretary of War. So in today's world, it's Secretary of Defense or Defense Department. And so, these generals would answer to the Secretary of War. But then the Secretary of War was to answer directly to the United States Congress. And that is a violation of the U.S. Constitution. That's a very controversial aspect of these laws, that the Secretary of War would be answering directly to the Congress. You'll recall this Congress doesn't like Andrew Johnson. He's kind of a drunk idiot from the South that they don't like. They're taking away control of Reconstruction from him in all these ways. But a big way is having the military answer to the Congress and not to the President of the United States. I take you back to what I said at the beginning of the Reconstruction topic. Nowhere in the Constitution does it have a paragraph that says, hey, in case of civil war, read the following paragraph. So all these people after the war, they're just trying to figure out, what do we do? What can we pass? What can we get away with? How do we reconstruct rebel states? So again, they're kind of fumbling through the dark. But I feel like in fumbling through the dark, they knew better than to do that, than to, have a Secretary of War answer directly to the Congress and not the President of the United States. Okay, our next step in Congressional Reconstruction. These Union generals would call for the election of delegates. To be a delegate, you just simply had to be an adult male. So African American men could vote for delegates under Congress. And to be a delegate, you just simply had to be an adult male. So African American men could also be elected as delegates as well. And that really is a big moment in American history where you have African American men voting for delegates. They themselves can be elected as delegates. And that really is a huge step in American history. under congressional Reconstruction, that African American men are now participating in that political process. Okay, once the delegates were elected, they would meet in the state capitals where they would draft new state constitutions. And you started to see more rights, more concerns addressed for African Americans, with African American men participating in congressional Reconstruction. Okay, so one more time to sort of bring that all together. Congressional Reconstruction, point number one, the South is divided into 5 military districts. Point number two, each district is headed up by a Union general. Point number three, the Union generals answer to the Secretary of War, who then answers to the United States Congress. Point number four, African American men, well, adult males, period, can vote for delegates, can be elected as delegates. Point number five, the delegates will meet in their various state capitals. Where point number six, they will draft new state constitutions. All right, you put all that together, and that is congressional Reconstruction. It is similar to presidential Reconstruction in some ways, but it definitely has some differences as well. All right, well, what really drove white Southerners crazy in 1867, aside from, just Congress taking over the process, was the enfranchisement of freedmen. That next point that you see there on your outline. Once African American men got the power to vote, the white South just couldn't handle that on so many levels. It drove them crazy that their former slaves were now considered as their equals. And it really isn't around that time you start to see organizations like the Ku Klux Klan popping up. Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1867 by a fellow named Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, as the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, generally he said that the whole premise, the whole idea was to keep African Americans from rising up, from exercising their rights. So, of all the things that are happening in this period of time, it's really the enfranchisement of freedmen that drove the white South the craziest. Okay, now looking at the fate of Andrew Johnson, our last point here on this PowerPoint. So this Congress really was looking for any excuse to get rid of Andrew Johnson at that point. They really saw him as nothing more than an impediment to their plans and their process. And along the way, the Congress had passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Now, under the Tenure of Office Act, the president could not fire any of his advisors unless he had congressional consent. So take, for example, Secretary of War. The guy who I said just a second ago has to answer directly to the Congress. President Johnson cannot fire that person unless he has permission from the Congress itself. No president in American history had ever had to live under that. I'd have liked to have seen him try it with Andrew Jackson. He fired quite a few of his advisors, his secretary of the various spots. And once Johnson was out of office, no other president would ever have to live under the Tenure of Office Act, because quite frankly, it truly is a flimsy law. It really was on so many levels kind of a violation in and of itself of the Constitution. So, this one president has to live under this idea that he has to get permission from Congress before he can, fire one of his advisors. All right, well, one day along the way, Andrew Johnson gets into a dust-up with his Secretary of War. A lot of it having to do with the fact the Secretary of War answers directly to Congress. So Johnson fires his Secretary of War. He just relieves him of his duties. He fires him on the spot. Congress says, okay, well, you violated the Tenure of Office Act. So they go straight to impeachment proceedings against President Andrew Johnson. By the way, when they passed the Tenure of Office Act, he vetoed it. They overrode his veto and passed it anyways. All right, so at that point, you are into impeachment proceedings. This is the first time in American history that that the attempt will be made to impeach a president of the United States. And so it turned into a bit of a vote in the House of Representatives. There in the House, they voted overwhelmingly to impeach. Then it went before the United States Senate, where it turned into a little bit of a trial. And by the narrowest of numbers, by one vote, Andrew Johnson was not impeached by the United States Congress. I came within one vote. It's the closest we've ever had, where a president of the United States would be removed from office. It was by one vote. But with that, Johnson just is a man sitting behind a desk. He really doesn't have any power. He really just at that point wrote out what was left of his presidency, which really wasn't much at all. And I've always said this. From that point going forward, you go through a series of what I like to call very unimpressive presidents of the United States. Um, got a lot of yes men, a lot of party hacks, some just outright corrupt people sitting in the office as well. And I've always said this, like you have a situation where Congress essentially is running our country, or it's like the dominant branch of our federal government. I'd say from 1868 all the way through October of 1901. It's like from the almost impeachment of Andrew Johnson to Teddy Roosevelt becoming president, you have a string of very unimpressive men sitting in the Oval Office. So it is a big moment in American history. Johnson, for his part, realizes he doesn't really have he doesn't have a chance going forward, politically speaking. The Democrats aren't going to run him for office. Definitely the Republicans are going to run him for office. So Johnson just rides out what's left. Congress is running the country at that point in time. They're definitely in charge of the South and Reconstruction. And so that gets us into this 1868 campaign. And in 1868, the Republicans are going to run a very famous man in that moment for the presidency. They're going to tap Ulysses S. Grant. I guess you could say the hero of the Civil War. This is the Union general who ultimately defeated Robert E. Lee. Many people believe he's the guy who won the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant, from a name standpoint, from a familiarity, sort of a famous standpoint, I don't know that you could have run a better candidate in 1868, just from a fame, familiarity standpoint. So Grant will run for the presidency here in 1868. And what the Republican Party was looking to do that year was really try to capitalize on some wins down in the South. Looking here at the next point of Southern state governments. The Republican Party was really hoping that African American voters would turn out in large numbers to support them in Southern campaigns here in 1868. Crazy thing happened that year. A lot of white Southerners viewed what was happening in the country as just blatantly illegal. They don't like what Congress is doing. They feel like congressional reconstruction is a violation of the Constitution. They don't like the treatment of Andrew Johnson at that point, his almost impeachment. So a lot of white Southern men, as sort of a protest, decided that they just wouldn't vote, that they weren't going to take part in the election there in 1868. It's kind of a weird situation of shooting yourself in the foot, but a lot of white men boycott the election by staying home, refusing to participate, refusing to register, and ultimately vote. And okay, fine, they did their protest, but the election happened anyways. And who did turn out in large numbers were African American men. And when they voted in 1868, they tended to vote for the Republican Party. Makes sense. I mean, it's the party of Lincoln, emancipation. At that moment in time, the Democratic Party is the party of secession, slavery, Civil War. So African American men turn out in 1868 in large numbers. They tend to vote Republican. And overnight, what happens in the South is these various Southern state governments are controlled by Republican electors. So the South becomes a Republican stronghold there in 1868. It's a brief moment in time where it'll happen. You have to go through the entirety of second half American history to understand how the parties change over time and the values and things like that. But in 1868, the Republicans win that election in a big way. They got a lot of governors of states in the South, the state legislatures. I'm not saying all of them, but primarily they tend to be majority Republicans in the South. So yeah, here in 1868, Southern state governments become Republican. Ulysses S. Grant goes on to win the presidency, and the Republican Party wins in a big way in the 1868 campaign. I guess you could say with the South being rebuilt, the Democratic Party is kind of trying to get, I guess for lack of a better term, its act together. The Democrats, they have some rebuilding to do themselves here during Reconstruction. Okay, but in looking at this era, we call it the age of radical control. It's known as the age of radical Republicans dominating the country. And let's talk about myths about these radicals first, then I'll try to explain who radicals were. But in looking at the myths about radicals, I don't know, a lot of lies were told about these Republican congressmen, state legislators, state governors. They were charged of fraud, corruption, all kinds of things. Let's see, in Louisiana, there was a story going around that the radical Republicans in charge of the state of Louisiana were raising taxes, and they were going to use the money to line their own pockets to buy each state legislator a case of whiskey. There were charges that they were buying gold spittoons for themselves, which a gold spittoon is what you would spit tobacco in. I don't know why it had to be made out of gold, but that was sort of the rumor that was going around at the time. So that's one myth, that they were raising taxes to buy whiskey, line their own pockets, gold spittoons, and things like that. In Virginia, weird stories started to come out that had no basis in reality whatsoever. That they were trying to take away a white man's right to bear arms. So they're trying to confiscate guns from white men in Virginia. I lived in the South my whole life, and I can tell you, if you want to get Southern men worked up crazy in a frenzy, you want to get them triggered. You talk about raising their taxes, and you talk about taking away their guns, and you will have a fight on your hands. I've also tried to explain it like this. Imagine if you lived in, I don't know, Tarrant County, Texas in 1868, 1869, and you read a story in the newspaper about how they're trying to take away a white man's right to bear arms in Virginia, and they're raising taxes in Louisiana to buy whiskey. I don't think you get on a horse and travel halfway across the continent to verify those stories. I think you just simply read it in your newspaper and you take it on face value that it's truth. So yeah, there's a lot of those lies being spread. I know this is shocking to you that newspapers would lie to people, the media would lie to people. But yeah, there were these various myths being perpetrated about these radicals, basically painting them in the picture of they're up to no good, they're corrupt, there are accounts of fraud and things like that, but there was never any proof really to verify those things. Now, it is true that these so-called radical Republicans were raising taxes, but they were raising taxes to try to help rebuild the South. They had these crazy notions of trying to build school systems in these various states. Maybe try to attract some railroads down to the South to bring some, I don't know, some better economy, jobs, things like that. So it is true that they were raising taxes, but it really wasn't for fraud or nefarious reasons. It was more about trying to build schools, railroads, rebuild the South itself after the war. Now, as far as who were these radicals, it tends to fall into three primary groups. I guess group number one is a group we will call the carpetbaggers. Carpetbagger was somebody from the North who came down to the South after the U.S. Civil War. You'll see here on your PowerPoint, in the bottom right-hand corner there's a artist rendering of carpetbaggers. See that one guy there looks like something crazy out of a Scooby-Doo cartoon or something. So a carpetbagger was a person who came from the North to the South after the Civil War. The idea being these carpetbaggers are up to no good. They're down here to take jobs and money and steal and all manner of fraud and abuse. So there's number one, carpetbaggery. Number two group, as far as who were radicals, number two is a scalawag. That's a crazy old pirate word. And scalawag basically means a traitor. And a scalawag was a Southerner who turns to Republican policies after the Civil War. A scalawag is kind of like, someone who you trust and then they stab you in the back. And honestly, of all these groups of these radicals, the scalawags were the ones the Southerners hated the most. Scalawag would have, or I'm sorry, a Southerner would have said, "Hey, look, I get Yankees are up to no good because they're Yankees, but I don't understand why a Southern man would stab his brothers in the back and do the things they're doing." So Scalawags were Southerners who turned Republican, in a sense, in their eyes, turned traitor after the war. Last not least, the third group are the freedmen, African Americans. They're being elected to office. They're serving in state legislators. They're serving as U.S. senators, even. So yeah, African American men make up that third part of the radical regimes. So one more time, who are the radicals? Number one, carpetbaggers. Number two, scalawags. And number three, African Americans. Now, when you look at that last point on your outline here, the role of freedmen in government, there was a real fear amongst white Southerners that African American men would be out for retribution, for revenge, for slavery and what had happened in the past. But actually, most African American men in government, they really just talked about um, equality. They talked about opportunity. They talked about, setting up education for their kids going forward, trying to get railroads through the South to help with prosperity and economics. So it really wasn't a case of retribution and revenge. The role of freedmen in government was more about opportunity than anything else. Last point to be made here on this slide, you look at the very bottom right of your slide, there's this cartoon rendering where you have this woman dressed in white. She's got a big carpet bag on her back and some soldiers off to the side. There's a lot of symbolism going on with that cartoon there. The woman in the dress represents the South. And what the artist is trying to tell you is the carpetbag government is bringing the South to its knees. That the South is about to collapse from the weight of the carpetbag government. So the artist what he's trying to tell you is if we could get the soldiers to leave, like if we get the U.S. Army out of here, and you can see those two soldiers with their bayonets, they're kind of propping up the carpetbag. If we could get the soldiers to walk away, the carpetbag would just collapse of its own weight. It would just topple and fall over. And then the South could rise again, is what they're trying to get at there with that artist rendering on the bottom right. And that's how Southerners felt then, and they would feel for a little while, is that the South would rise again. So yeah, get the Army to go away, get that carpetbag off her back, and the South can rise again. All right, well, the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution along the way. And the 15th Amendment is really about what had happened in 1868 with the election. Now, the 15th Amendment is about trying to protect African American voting rights. The 15th Amendment essentially says that you cannot deny someone the right to vote, based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's what's going on with the 15th Amendment. You cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. I understand where their hearts were, what they were trying to do by passing the 15th Amendment. But they actually left a hole in the amendment so big you could drive a Mack truck right through the thing. They've told you in that moment that you can't deny someone the right to vote based on a set of criteria: race, color, previous condition of servitude. But in years to come, Southerners will say, okay, well, I can't deny people the right to vote based on that, but it doesn't say anything about taking away the right to vote based on payment of a poll tax, or owning acres of land, or being literate and being able to read. So yeah, the 15th Amendment is about trying to protect African American voting rights, but then along is going to come this thing called Jim Crow, and Jim Crow is how Southerners will get around that 15th Amendment. So Jim Crow is something we'll talk about later on in our class. But yeah, the 15th Amendment was trying to protect African American voting rights, but then Jim Crow came along and took away those rights anyways. All right, well, you look at the South in 1870, and most historians would agree this thing called the Ku Klux Klan was on a reign of terror across the southern states. The Ku Klux Klan is that organization founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Its sole purpose in life was intimidation and terror of African Americans. They didn't really use this word back then, but in today's vernacular, it's a terrorist organization, is what it is. It breeds fear. It seeks to dominate through fear and intimidation. And what the KKK wanted in 1870 was for African Americans to not vote. They want the Democratic Party back in power, the radical Republicans out of power. And the KKK just went about, I don't know, intimidating people, killing people. Lynchings were happening. A lynching is like a racially motivated murder, a hanging of someone, if you will. Usually, the KKK would try to get someone to stop talking about voting rights or voting by intimidation. You see there on the bottom left of the PowerPoint, you've got this man in a room surrounded by all these men. This African American man there is in the middle with guns pointed to his head. It might be hard to see, but there in the background of the drawing, there's another African American man being dragged down the street into that room. And that's what they would try to do at first, was intimidation, physical violence, fear. If that didn't work, then they would lynch people. They would just hang them from trees and murder them. The lynchings usually took place along like a road or a trail that people would use. They wanted this to sort of be broadcast. They want everybody to see what happened. And the message was, hey, if you're going to talk about your rights and vote and things like that, you'll end up dead just like this guy here. So yeah, that's what the Klan was about, was intimidation, terror, and fear. It got so bad that at some point the government realized it had to react. You see there the passage of the KKK Act along the way. And the KKK Act gave the President of the United States the right to declare martial law in areas of high Klan activity. So wherever the KKK was up to no good, doing its evil acts, President Grant could declare martial law, send the United States military into that area, and deal with it effectively through physical force. The KKK Act was used quite a bit by President Grant. In fact, the state where it was used the most was South Carolina in 1870. But eventually, slowly but surely, the United States military put down the KKK. Eventually, slowly but surely, those who were in it, I don't know, they went into hiding, or they burned their robes, or they just tried to disassociate themselves completely from the thing. And honest to God's truth, at some point, the U.S. Army, through the KKK Act, managed to effectively destroy the Ku Klux Klan there in the 1870s. Sadly, though, when later topics will look at the reemergence of the KKK. It's like it got crushed, but then decades later it came slithering out from under a rock and reappears again in American history. But also what you start to see there in the 1870s, especially the early 1870s, is a lot of declining support from northern states and the North in general with Reconstruction. I don't know, at some point, Northerners just began to realize that the South would have to recognize it was wrong, and the South would have to want to change for real change to come about. But in 1872, the General Amnesty Act was passed by the Congress. You can see there on your PowerPoint where the General Amnesty Act is. What the General Amnesty Act effectively does is forgive the past. It forgives secession, it forgives civil war. The General Amnesty Act, most people agree, is sort of the North saying to the South, let's put aside our differences, let's try to come together, heal the wounds of the country, and move forward. With the General Amnesty Act of 1872, most people agree that's sort of the beginning of the end of Reconstruction or rebuilding the South after the Civil War. There's a lot of reasons for that declining support. I think one is just simply time. At that point, Reconstruction's lasted 7 years. It'll end up lasting roughly 12 before it's over. The war itself lasted 4 years. The post-war peace ends up lasting 12. So I think just time has a way of declining that northern support. A second thing I would say is a lot of those radical Republicans who just were out to change just the ways of the South. those hardcore sort of zealots to the cause of Reconstruction. By 1872, they're getting a little older. They're retiring from politics. They passed away. Thaddeus Stevens, for example, in the House of Representatives, considered a radical Republican. He had died by 1872. Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, had retired from politics at that point in time. So sort of the older guys, the zealots, the hardcore radicals who were committed, they're retiring, they're passing away. And attitudes are really starting to shift up north in the early 1870s. There's something called an industrial revolution that's just taken off. People are starting to become more interested in money and profit than they are necessarily civil rights. And a new type of politician was arriving in Washington, D.C. He wore a power suit. He was more interested in finances and building railroads and money than he was necessarily standing up for African American rights down in the southern states. So anyway, you put it all together, there's a lot of different reasons for that declining support up north. And now looking here at letter L, redemption of the South. By the time you get to 1876, the Democratic Party has taken over most of the southern states. And redemption just simply means the Democrats had been elected into power. By 1876, the so-called radical Republicans have been voted out. Southern states have primarily Democratic politicians in charge of them. And, most of the South had been, quote, redeemed, or Democrats were in charge by 1876. Now, if you look at that map on the bottom left, the election returns from 1876, there were 3 southern states where Republicans still held some level of control. And you look at that and you can see that 3 things don't look like the others. In Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, the Republican Party still had some level of control. That's going to play big in this election of 1876 and how the thing ultimately plays out. Okay, in the election of 1876, we are going to have Rutherford B. Hayes. He's at that moment, he's the governor of Ohio. Had served in the U.S. Civil War in the Union Army. He's running for the Republican Party, Rutherford B. Hayes is. And he's going to go up against Samuel Tilden. He's the Democratic governor of New York at that moment in time. So Hayes versus Tilden is the fight here in the election of 1876. Again, Hayes for the Republicans, Tilden for the Democrats. And when the election results come in for 1876, on the surface, it looks like Rutherford B. Hayes is going to go on to win the presidency. But then as they start to sort of look at the election returns in those 3 southern states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, they started to find there were some interesting situations that had played. In Louisiana, for example, there were ghosts voting in that campaign. There were people who had been dead for quite some time who were casting votes down in Louisiana. Over in Florida, they were missing entire election boxes. Ballot boxes had just gone missing. Nobody knew where they were, and nobody would find them. Decades later, though, when they were draining the Everglades swamps in Florida, looking to build some houses out in that area, as they drained the swamps, they found these old boxes lying in the bottom of the swamps. They got them, looked at them, pried them open, and it turned out to be some election returns from the 1876 campaign. They've been sitting in the swamp for 50 years. So there is some type of fraud taking place in Louisiana. Of course, Florida is always going to be a problem in an election. And, in South Carolina, that's where the KKK Act was used the most. I promise you I can show you election results after election result after election result where South Carolina votes Democrat, Democrat, Democrat every single time. Same being true for Florida and Louisiana. So it was pretty obvious that some sort of a fraud was taking place. Samuel Tilden, for his part, if he could just get like even one of these states to go his way, he's got a very convincing case for becoming president of the United States. So Tilden lawyered up. He vowed to fight this thing. And the country doesn't have a clear-cut winner in the election of 1876 because of charges of fraud in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. It got to be 1877, and we still didn't have a election result. The country was all kinds of worked up crazy over who had won this thing. And this really was an intense election. This really was a big fight over who would come out as the next president of the United States. So to solve the matter, party leaders on both sides, both the Democrats and the Republicans, got together in a Washington, D.C. hotel, and they sat down and figured out this thing we call the Compromise of 1877. And the Compromise of 1877 is what will end Reconstruction in the United States. So you might write that down. I don't know, you might get asked on the test the question, what ended Reconstruction in the United States? And the answer to that question is the Compromise of 1877. All right, so party leaders, both sides, sit down. You can just kind of imagine in your mind a smoky hotel room. Things look kind of suspicious, a little dark, a little dank, a lot of whiskey, a lot of cigar smoke, a lot of wheeling and dealing as the Democrats and Republicans try to figure out who the next president's going to be. All right, well, the Republicans, in sitting down at that table, what they want is Rutherford B. Hayes to be president. That's their big thing. That's what they're looking for, is Rutherford B. Hayes to win this election of 1876. The Democrats, for their part, of course, they would love to have Tilden in the White House, but I think they saw an opportunity for something else. So the Democrats are going to make an offer, and the offer, the compromise, basically boils down to this. The Democrats tell the Republicans, hey, look, Hayes can become the next president. That's fine. We'll do that. But for Hayes to be president, you have to give us the following things. And number one, they want federal dollars to be spent on rebuilding the South. Believe it or not, at that point, there is still some rebuilding to be done. Yeah, they want Uncle Sam to pony in some of those federal dollars to help rebuild the South. So that's number one, federal dollars to rebuild the South. Number two, they want the U.S. Army removed as an occupying force from the southern states. No more enforcing Reconstruction policies. Remember the cartoon drawing where if they could get rid of the soldiers, the carpetbag would collapse, the South could rise again. So number two, they want the Army removed as an occupying force. And number three, they want to guarantee that Reconstruction is over. No more punitive policies. No more coming after the southern states. Number three, an agreement that Reconstruction was over. And if the Republican Party could grant those three things, then the Democrats would pitch their support over to Hayes becoming the next president of the United States. Handshakes were made, deals were done. And in the Compromise of 1877, everybody lived up to their word. And Rutherford B. Hayes goes on to be kind of a forgettable president of the United States. Samuel Tilden goes to his grave believing that he was robbed. And of all the people who have ever claimed fraudulent elections and stolen elections, I tell you, that guy's got the most convincing case. But Reconstruction is over. Federal dollars will be spent on the South. The Army's removed as an occupying force. And Reconstruction is officially over with the Compromise of 1877. I've also always said this. You can kind of imagine Republicans as they're walking out the door saying to their Democratic counterparts, hey, one thing we would ask of you guys is to respect African American voting rights down in the South. And you can also imagine Democrats with smiles on their faces and fingers crossed behind their back saying, why, sure, we would never do such a thing. But sure enough, Jim Crow is right around the corner down there in those southern states. But truth be told, Jim Crow would become a national policy along the way. Talk about that later as we go. All right, so to finish out Reconstruction and look at its legacies, we look at these legacies of Reconstruction. We talk about how there's a lot of bad things that come out of this period known as Reconstruction. I always personally have said that the government should get an A for effort. Federal government, the Northerners, they really did try here. But ultimately, you have to look at Reconstruction as a failure on several levels. Number one, there's the political failure of Reconstruction. The Republican Party did not build a base in the southern states, not one that would win in big ways anyways. Politically speaking, the South will be a one-party region for decades to come. They would vote Democrat, Democrat, Democrat every single time. I got to a point where they called themselves the Dixiecrats, kind of like the land of Dixie and the Democratic Party, so they called themselves the Dixiecrats. Let's see, they call themselves Yellow Dog Democrats. It's kind of a weird thing. They said if the Republican Party were running the greatest candidate you'd ever seen in your life, if the Republicans were running some great candidate and the Democrats were running a dumb yellow dog, they said I'd vote for the dumb yellow dog every time. In other words, what they're saying is it doesn't matter who the Republican Party is running. It doesn't matter what that person stands for. We're voting Democrat, Democrat, Democrat every single time. Because from a Southern perspective, the Democratic Party represented secession, it represented slavery, but it also represented the party that they felt stood up for them in that age of radical Republican control. So yeah, the Yellow Dog Democrats really emerged hard here during Reconstruction. It's something that's there through the 1960s. Later in our class, we'll talk about the South becoming more of a Republican stronghold than a Democratic stronghold. But you got to give me a semester before I get to the change to come. Okay, economically speaking, the South will be tied to the soil backwards and really not embrace modernization till the outbreak of World War II, for the United States anyways. Economically speaking, the South will just continue to stick with cotton and cash crops for generations to come. Meanwhile, up north, man, they got an industrial revolution going on. They are diversifying, they are industrializing, they've got all these new ways of making money emerge. And yeah, down south, it's just picking cotton and rice and sugar and tobacco and things like that. I don't know. It's just the South refused to change. Look, industry, that's Yankee talk. Factories, that's Yankee stuff. They're just going to stick with what's tried and true, and that's agriculture and the soil. Now, they couldn't rely on slavery anymore. Slavery had been eradicated. But eventually the sharecrop system did emerge, and they'd go with sharecropping in a big way. So, yeah, economically speaking, the South stayed tied to the soil and backwards. Later in our semester, we'll look at a not so great depression, talking about something called the New Deal, where Franklin Roosevelt's trying to get the country back up on its feet in the midst of the Depression. And there's a point where Franklin Roosevelt asks his advisors, what's the thing that's holding us back? He spent millions and millions of dollars creating jobs for the unemployed, did all these various ideas to try to jumpstart the economy. And Roosevelt just says, look, if spending money is the answer, I've spent money and it's not the answer. So what's holding the country back? And Roosevelt's advisors would tell him that the South is what was holding the country back, that it was not innovative, that it was not modernized, that it was still tied to the soil and backwards. And so, yeah, in the midst of the Great Depression, this being tied to the soil, being backwards, not embracing change and modernization, it didn't just hurt the South, it hurt the entire country, truth be told, and held the country back. So it's not good for the South to refuse to embrace change, modernization, diversification, and things like that. It ultimately just hurts the entire country that it stays economically tied to the soil. Last not least, probably the most damning of all, is race relations and how deplorable they'll be in America going forward. With the end of the Civil War, Lincoln talked about the country emerging with a new birth of freedom. There was that slight moment where African American men had political power, they could vote, they had civil rights. And then along the way comes something called Jim Crow. And one by one, those civil rights are taken away. And in so many ways, African Americans were treated like second-class citizens after the U.S. Civil War, all the way through the 1960s, heck, even into the 1970s, if I'm being honest with you. Race relations became deplorable. And I don't know, Jim Crow, I need to save it for later on in our semester. It's a huge topic. It takes a lot of time. But yeah, African Americans will be segregated based on race from white society at large. And with that segregation, you just have second class, in so many ways, being treated like second class citizens for African Americans. There was a real opportunity here to admit that wrong was wrong, to do something about equality and race relations in the United States, but on so many levels. Um, White supremacy was retained, segregation became the norm, and race relations were just deplorable going forward in our country. And if you look at second half American history in a sort of a big picture way, these three things are a large part of second half American history: politics and the way it plays out in the country, the economic change, and industrial revolution in the 1920s, what some people call a second industrial revolution taking place, so economic change, coming out of World War II, all that economic change, and race relations, whether that's Jim Crow era or the civil rights struggle. Those three things are all a huge part of second half American history. And what you can say is the country utterly failed in the age of Reconstruction to properly address any of those topics that you see there on the PowerPoint. All right, well, that's it for Reconstruction. Take care.